Hi, this is Synthchaser with synthchaser.com. Today we're going to be restoring Jonathan's ARP Omni 2. The keyboard is mostly working and has a few issues. Inside, its voicing boards have the gating capacitors here have been recapped, but everywhere else throughout it still has the original tantalum capacitors. So we're going to do a general refurbishment. We're going to change the rest of the tantalum capacitors. We're going to clean the sliders. We're going to redo the key bed, so some of the keys are kind of sticking. Others need bushings. Here's a cracked key. We're going to do a couple other repairs, like there's a broken slider shaft here. And then there's a couple features on the keyboard that aren't working right, and any that don't resolve when we do that general restoration we're going to repair. Notably, the chorus phaser button here is stuck on, so you can't get the really good string sounds that you expect to get out of this instrument. Another issue is the mix between strings and synth is not working right, so I've just turned off all the string voices and I have on a synthesizer voice. This slider controls the mix, so in the middle it's a good balance. It's a 50-50 balance between string and synth. If you push it over here, you won't hear strings and you'll only hear synth. And if you push it over this side to string, you should only hear string and not hear the synth. So right now I have string turned off and I have a synth voice on, and I push the slider all the way to string and I'm hearing the synth voice. So the slider seems to have no control over the synthesizer voice, but the string voice it does have control over. So that's an issue that we're going to be looking into. Another problem that I noticed is the bass voices. I'll turn on cello because it's most obvious on that. I'll turn it up. You hear there's noise as the note decays, like white noise. So we're going to want to fix that so it sounds clean. So I'll open up this keyboard and we'll get started with the general restoration. One other thing that I noticed is the VCF control doesn't seem to be working. So as I sweep the VCF frequency, I'm not really hearing any change in the sound. We're going to do the filter enhancement on this, which raises the cutoff frequency, so that it's going to change the sound that this makes anyway. But generally, you expect the sound to get brighter as you sweep it up maybe to about halfway, and then the sound really doesn't change in the top half of this frequency slider. But in this case, I'm not really hearing any change at all. And if I sweep the resonance like at the low cutoff, and I'll sweep the resonance at the high cutoff, there's really no difference there. So that's another thing that we're going to be looking into. One other thing I'll mention, problems like the button being stuck on. I'm not going to recap everything and then put the boards back in and then troubleshoot this. Preemptively, I'm going to replace the flip-flop that controls this, and I'll also have a look and see if the switch is working. But the fact that it's stuck on when you turn the keyboard on, to me, indicates that the flip-flop is bad. So things like this, where I can make an educated guess at what the problem is, I'm going to change the components when I have them out to do the recapping, rather than recap it, put the board back in, troubleshoot to conclusively determine what the problem is, take the board back out and change the part. It would just be time efficient and save the customer money that way. First thing I'm going to do is the power supply. There's 3 quick connect terminals here, which you disconnect, and this disconnects the power wiring. Of course, make sure you have the keyboard completely unplugged, not just turned off when you do this. Then there's 4 screws on the bottom of the case, 4 on this side and 2 over here. And there's a connector that takes the power up to the lower voicing board here. I'm just going to disconnect that and work this through, and then I'll be able to lift out the power supply. There's going to be some old heatsink compound mixed with a lot of dust and dirt here. You can clean that off and clean off the bottom of the case. We'll apply some new thermal compound when we remount it. And on this, we're going to be changing the capacitors. So there's 3 electrolytic capacitors here. These are really, really old. They have a date code of 52nd week of 1977. So they're nearly 40 years old. And there's also 3 tantalum capacitors here that we're going to replace. The rest of the power supply here looks okay, and we know it's working, so we'll just change these capacitors and then put it back in. So I've recapped the power supply with these beautiful new high temperature low ESR capacitors, and I've reconnected the quick connect terminals. I haven't screwed this in yet. What I'm going to do is I'm going to test the power supply. It's currently disconnected from the rest of the keyboard, so I'm going to turn the keyboard on. And I'm going to test the power supply to make sure that the voltage rails are within reason. So with my multimeter on volts, I'm going to probe the purple and the black, and I get minus 15.14, which is fine. Now I'm going to probe the red and the black, and I get 15.19, which is fine. So the power supply has been rebuilt successfully. And now I can mount it inside the keyboard and feel free to connect it to the rest of the synthesizer. For heatsink compound, they sell little syringes of ceramic heatsink compound, you know, for $5 to $20 for a few grams. But you can get a 3-ounce tube of this silicone heatsink compound, which works fine for these applications. And this whole tube costs less than $10. So look for this online. This is a big saver on if you're going to be using a lot of heatsink compound. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the heatsink compound here under this part where it touches the case, and I'm going to screw it down nice and tight. With the power supply reinstalled and secured, the next board I'm going to turn my attention to is this board here, which is the bass voice board. This is also kind of a difficult board to get out relative to the other boards in the synthesizer, and I'll show you how we do that. So first, disconnect the connectors on the back here, and then we're going to turn the synthesizer around, and then we're going to take the nuts off these jacks. There's 7 of them that we need to take off, and we're going to use a 1/2-inch socket to do that. And when you take them off, don't lose the little washers, and on the inside there's also going to be a washer. And finally there's 2 screws here that you can remove with a 1/4-inch socket. Once you take the bass voice board out, you might as well take the rest of the boards out as well. There's like a tangled web of interconnections here, and it's difficult to work on these one at a time. Like if I were to put the bass board back, I would have to remove it again to take out this board, because this cable plugs in on the back side here, so I can't get to it when the bass board is installed, and it doesn't unplug. It's soldered in up here, it's not socketed. So at this point I'm going to take all the rest of the boards out of the keyboard. So here we go, we have all the circuit boards out of the keyboard. We're going to be replacing all these blue blob tantalum capacitors. These gating capacitors for the polyphonic notes have already been changed, but the gating capacitors for the monophonic notes haven't been changed. And all the rest of the capacitors are still original. So we're going to change the capacitors, and then I'm going to desolder and disassemble and clean all 15 sliders. And the one that has the broken shaft, while I've got it open to clean it, I'm going to replace the shaft. Here's all the boards taken out of the keyboard with the parts that we're going to change stripped off. So all the sliders are off. We're going to open those up and disassemble them and clean them up. I've taken the switch assembly off the synthesizer control board. We're going to repair the one button that's latched on. I took the voltage controlled filter off the synthesizer board here, and I've removed the components that we're changing for the enhancement. The the upper and lower voicing boards here. Some of the capacitors had already been replaced with aluminum electrolytics. Others I still needed to change. Here's the phaser with its capacitors removed and the baseboard with its capacitors removed. I also pulled an op amp off of there that I'm going to change, taking a stab at the synth string mix issue. Also, I noticed that some capacitors had just been cut off the boards. They're decoupling capacitors, so things will probably still work, but you know, they're there for a reason, so we're going to put those back. Next, I'm going to put all the capacitors back, clean the sliders, and put those back. So these are 4 sliders that I've opened up, and I've cleaned the one in the upper right, and I haven't cleaned the other 3. So the top half is the resistive element, and the bottom half is the conductive metal track. You can see the one that I cleaned, the metal track is nice and shiny. The one on the lower left, and even the one on the lower right, I mean, it's hard to even tell the difference between the conductive track and the resistive track, the carbon track. It's that dirty. Also, the slider shaft, I've cleaned and polished the metal contacts there, and cleaned all the grime out of the part that rubs along the plastic top of the slider. So I thought we'd do a little experiment, and you can visually see what cleaning the sliders can do. So right now I've hooked up one of the old sliders that I haven't cleaned yet. So I have it connected to a power supply, and I have the oscilloscope probing the wiper of the slider, and I'm just going to move the slider across, and you can see all that noise there. I've worked it a few times, and there's still a lot of noise, particularly on that, the noise being scratchiness, you know, where the wiper's going over dirt and losing and making contact. So now I'm going to connect one of the sliders that I've cleaned, and we'll take a look at that. So now I've connected a slider that I've cleaned by disassembling, polishing everything inside, and then reassembling it. And this is the same value slider. It's a 1 meg audio taper, and we're going to take a look at this one. And there's none of that scratchiness that we saw with the previous one. So visually you can see what a dirty slider, and this keyboard was working still with those sliders, but you can see visually what a scratchy slider looks like under the oscilloscope. So with all the boards recapped, the sliders cleaned and reinstalled, the filter modified and reinstalled, before I put these back, I wanted to take a look at this switchboard here. The chorus phaser button is stuck on, and the switch doesn't work. And this is also an early revision of this board. It doesn't match the service manual, doesn't use flip-flops. I was just planning on changing out a flip-flop, but this is the one that uses these hex inverters. And someone had changed the hex inverter chips. They're more modern than the what would have been there originally. And so I was taking a look at how it works for that particular button, which pin on the hex inverter it connects to. And I noticed what looked like potentially a broken trace, a cut trace, or a broken solder joint. And I tested it with the meter, and sure enough, this one here, I don't know if you'll be able to see it, the trace is not making contact with the pad. So I'm going to reflow that with a little tiny bit of wire to bridge the difference, and we'll see if that resolves the problem in our little test setup. With an ever small amount of solder applied there to restore the broken connection, now the chorus phaser button turns on and off like it should, and we can put this back in. And since we were able to fix this without having to troubleshoot it in the synthesizer, we saved a lot of time. So the boards are back in the case and connected, with the exception of the key bed, which since these cables are delicate, I'm going to take the key bed out now while it's disconnected from the boards, and do the bushings and the key contacts and all that stuff that we're going to do. One thing I had noticed when the key bed was in the keyboard was, particularly on this side of the keyboard, the keys kind of curve in here, and I thought maybe it would be the key bed wasn't sitting there straight, or the keys weren't lined up with the holes right. But now that I have it out, I can see actually the back of the key bed here is bent, so these are pushed further back. So what I'm going to do is, I'm not going to wash the keys, so I'm not going to take the keycaps off, but I'm going to take the whole key lever off to change the bushings, and I'm going to see if I can bend this the key bed back in that spot to get rid of this curve here. This is the key bed with the keys and the old bushings removed, and you can see that the key bed, the key stops here aren't level. This will cause some keys to stop higher up than others and give a crooked, not level appearance to the keyboard. Here's another one that's really bad. In general, this whole area is pretty bad looking. And then once I got the keys off, you can see here this metal part kind of bends back here. I'm looking straight down on it here, and you can see it's straight. And as I get towards the end, it goes further back. So this is pulling those keys on the right side of the keyboard back and causing the keyboard to look curved. So I'm going to try to straighten this up as best as I can, and we'll put the new bushings on and clean the key contacts and then put everything back together. So we've got everything back together, and things are working a lot better, sounding a lot better too. The filter's working. And the synth string mix is also fixed. I had taken a stab at replacing an op amp responsible for mixing those two sections, and that seemed to resolve the issue. The chorus phaser button, as you know, is now working. And here's the pile of stuff that I removed from the keyboard. The old electrolytic and tantalum capacitors, bad op amp, some broken slider parts, and a broken key. So now this keyboard is done with its visit to Synthchaser's workshop, and it's ready to go home. This is Synthchaser from synthchaser.com, thanking you for watching. If you have any questions on repairing ARP Omnis, other ARP synthesizers, or other vintage synthesizers, please post in the comments or visit me on my website, synthchaser.com. Thanks for watching.